We apologize for not having many printing on the tables as we are trying to be a green forum by reducing paper usage, and also remind us all that the water dispensers are just outside the conference room, and we also want to reduce the use of plastic bottles. Just to remind us again before we start that we have the Manaya Market downstairs. These are all the women vendors from the Pacific, which includes Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, Solomons, and Niue. With special thanks to the governments of Australia for funding their attendance through the UN Women's Regional Markets for Change project. These are our regular entrepreneurial mothers, aunties, grandmothers, and some young women vendors as well from across the Pacific, selling at their local markets or on the sides of the road. The money they make go to pay for the school fees for their children, for their health care, and many of other important necessities. They are here to share their beautiful artifacts and handicrafts with us all, showing their resilience and spirits of always searching for a better future for themselves, their children, and their families. As one of the key focus of our events today is economic empowerment, let us all do our part by helping economically empower them by buying and taking a piece of their culture and artifacts with us back to Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Also, just to remind us all again, we have the Vausa Art Gallery of Paradise at Risk happening just across the road at the Ministry of Women, Toa Salamasina Foyer. Again, these are artifacts from across the Pacific, sharing with us their vision of the impact of climate change on our Pacific paradise. If you have a spare moment, I really humbly ask everyone to go and visit them just opposite this conference room and across the road. Finally, the incredible display you have all been enjoying just behind or just outside the conference room are the traditionally inspired Samoan clothes inspired by our traditional wear and made entirely from all the materials from our natural environments, including our oceans. Some of these pieces have graced the runway of the Miss Samoa, as well as the Miss Pacific and Miss Pacific, worn by Miss Samoas and Miss Pacific. All of these are created locally by Le'atawa Lesa, Jerry Brunt. He is the co-owner of the Arata Hotel with his wife, Charlotte Jan Mal Brunt. So before I hand over to our moderator, our first session for today, I just have a reminder, I still have with me a pair of glasses if anyone is missing their pair of glasses. Thank you. Enjoy your day.
Well, hello, everybody. Some of you will remember me from yesterday, but just to reintroduce myself, my name's Jude Kelly. I'm a theatre director, and 15 years ago I started the WOW Women of the World festivals around the world to celebrate everything that girls... Thank you. To celebrate everything that girls, women and non-binary people have done, will do, and definitely can do, provided we pull away all the barriers and all the obstacles that prevent everybody from realizing their potential. It's a joyous, inclusive festival and celebration that makes it possible for boys and men and people of all genders to come together and think, what an amazing thing it is to be a human being. What an amazing thing. And isn't it absolutely crazy that we put barriers and obstacles in front of human potential? When we see it realized, we all recognize that it drives humanity forward in the most amazing way. Now, the session this morning, we have some wonderful speakers. I'm going to ask them to come onto the stage while I vamp until you get here. They're all specialists in this area that we're talking about this morning, which is leave no one behind. And I was thinking about the way that we kind of quickly fall into jargon, because a really good friend of mine, Kimberly Crenshaw, an African-American academic, invented in 1992 a phrase called intersectionality, which we use quite a lot. But she describes it as a metaphor. And I just want to reread what she says about it. Intersectionality is a metaphor for understanding the way that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that are not understood among conventional ways of thinking. And I think that's really critical, that we understand that conventional ways of thinking will mean that we won't understand other people's obstacles, other people's life experiences, and our own biases and prejudices. And I speak as somebody who, as a cisgendered white woman from the global north, I have learned what I have learned so far, which is probably not enough yet, about what I have been instructed to think was conventional, normal ways of thinking, and how wrong I have been about, the idea of, like, my life defining normality. And so I think this morning, even though we're going to talk about policies and we're going to talk about practice and we're going to talk about specific examples of good practice, I also wanted just to, recognize the fact that we're all people and we've all come from different backgrounds and that we have our lived experience which has driven us into this space which is essentially about human rights. And I guess that's why you're all here too, unless you're just here because you've got a job. But it's not really normal to be somewhere at 9 o'clock to discuss human rights for another whole day just because it happens to be your job, because you'd probably be bunking off and trying to go swimming. But no, you're all here. So you'll have your own personal reason why this matters to you. And I'm just going to come to each of our panel members and ask that question. So I'm not going to give them long introductions. They have fantastic Wikipedia entries if you want to do that. But I am going to just recognize the fact that we've got far right, Haki Ellefson, who's the regional representative for the Pacific on UN human rights. Next to her, Sua Helen Walwork, who's the Attorney General and the chair of the Pacific Island Law Officers Network in Samoa. Jolene Mataele, vice chair. Big it up for her, obviously. The Commonwealth Equity Network chair, vice chair, and the Tonga Latest Association, am I saying that correctly? Program coordinator, yeah. And then we have somebody we heard from yesterday, Steve Letsky, MP, who's the Deputy Minister of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities in South Africa. And Shruti Mohapatra, who's the Vice Chair of the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum, India. So actually, I'm going to start with you, Jolene, which is, we talked this morning about sometimes people are pushed into fighting for human rights because they very much have to start with their own that are visibly being intruded upon. And I just wondered whether you'd just like to tell us a bit about how you developed into the professional person you are now.
Thank you very much, Jude. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the people of the land and the people of Samoa. Talo falava, malo lele, and nisan bulavinaka, and good day to you all. My life started, I guess my experience started when I was back in school, when I was still in my little khaki pants and I was always being mocked. I was always being stigmatized just because of the person I was. I was always flamboyant. But the difference between some of our ladies back at home was I was always a fighter. I was always a fist fighter. I will never let anyone go without being slapped. If anybody says the wrong thing to me, I will turn around and slap that person, or I will fight back.
Okay, so careful in the coffee queue, folks.
But then when I grew up and started, working as a human rights defender, it started when the first person was brought, a first trans person who was brought to Tonga by her family to die in Tonga because she had AIDS. And because of that, and because she was a trans person, everybody started calling us AIDS instead of our names. So everywhere we'd be walking down the street, walking to catch the bus, someone would turn around and say, "Hey, AIDS." And that started a thought, and working closely with the Ministry of Health and two uncles of mine who were leading figures on HIV awareness programs. And that's how we started. We actually started the Tonga Ladies Association to educate our own community on safe sex. Sorry, but I have to use those words because it's, so it be clear to everybody. And HIV awareness, how to take care of themselves, and of course, human rights issues, that they have the right to be themselves. So my work started from there, and then it went from there to platforms in starting the Tonga Ladies Association in 1992. From there, we started the Pacific Sexual Gender Diversity Network in 2007 because we were invited to an Asia Pacific conference in Australia, and we walked in. There was no Pacific Islander over there, and they said, "Oh, but we have Australia and New Zealand." I turned around and said, "No. I'm sorry, nothing against New Zealand and Australia, but if you want to see the real Pacific, this is the real Pacific." Okay? Flowers, everything. You cannot, all these small Pacific islands are always, neglected. And you cannot say that Asia Pacific is this. No. And that's how we started the Pacific Sexual Gender Diversity Network. And from there, I moved my way into the first Pacific person to be involved with the International ILGA World Conference, ILGA World organization, and from there I am now with the Commonwealth Equality Network.
Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to give that example. It's a long way from being bullied in khaki shorts to sitting on a stage, with the amount of knowledge you have, representing very wide needs in communities, but also educating everybody as to why they can, through deliberate bias or just stupidity or ignorance, make people feel excluded, which is really the subject of our panel, like how to leave no one behind. Steve, you also, I think, have been driven by both personal experience and then the need to demonstrate representation of people who feel invisible. Would you just talk a little bit about, your journey to human rights?
No, thanks, Judy. I think coming from South Africa and being born in South Africa, and the history of South Africa in terms of apartheid and oppressive system, intersectionality has always been part of this. But at a very young age, at the age of 13, we navigated in the school system the transition of apartheid government into democratic government. And as a young person, you get involved in that activism at a very young age. I was recruited by the Congress of the Student, which was operating at a high school level at the time, but fighting for education system that also speaks a language we can understand. But, and also the fact that one was involved at that time also in the Youth League, of the African National Congress. But as years were going by, something that relates to me, whether at the time it was around gender expression or identity, because it wasn't so much of sexual orientation at the teenage years. Sexual orientation is when you are attracted to somebody else. But at teenage years, when you are not attracted to anyone, it's not so much about your sexual orientation, but so much about your own identity. And I think we did not have a template. You are growing up in a heteronormative environment. The only people you see is your mom, your father, it's your grandparents, it's your neighbors who look the same. And we never had templates. And even if you see someone, they never speak about it. And I think for me, at that young, very tender age, I needed something that speaks to me beyond everything that, speaks to the oppressive systems that we are challenging on a daily basis. And that's how I really got to start learning and start to reach out more than just the community that I belong to. Because you can imagine black people were segregated. You are all in a township. You are outside CBDs, outside centers of economy. So for you to get out of your village, your township, you would need to really get out to get to learn more information and get that. And that's how I got to be involved and volunteer, I think around the age of 15, 16. There was an organization called OUT, which is the second oldest queer organization in South Africa. And that's how I got to connect with many other people. But I think part of it is that one then became much more involved in the social justice movement to deal with quite a lot of, inequalities, gender issues, seeking justice in whichever way, including public health and so forth. But I did not leave my political home. I continued being part of, my own political home. But I think the emergence even of going through school, going through varsity, allows you also to open up in your knowledge and in your understanding of how development works on its own. My first job, official job, was in government, and I did not enjoy it, and I left 2 years later. It was social development. I just thought everything is just slow, moving slow, and I needed to be out.
That is true.
Yeah, I needed to be out of the system. I just didn't want the system to trap me, and I got involved in civil society much more, and things were moving. We looked at policy work, but a lot of it, personally, is political.
Yeah.
So whether you look at it whichever way, as long as you are fighting for liberation, it must be liberation for all. And it's not only just about you, it's people around you. And every now and then you experience that everybody experiences inequality. And you have to stand up because you have experienced it, you know it. Somebody is experiencing it, and you need to build solidarity. So every now and then our conscience builds in us to make a world a better place. And that's how I consistently, personally, but also professionally, continue to be part of the social justice movement.
Yeah. And I think this is a really key thing, isn't it? That we understand, that we empathize through other people's pain, through our own pain. Sometimes we're not happy to acknowledge our own pain because sometimes pain is shameful, or we're encouraged to feel it's shameful. Actually, shame is a fantastic galvanizer, as is anger, if you can hold the pain and recognize that it's been put on you as something which is not, of your doing, and you can use it. So, Shriti, I'm going to come to you. I mean, I have currently no visible disabilities, but I'm assuming I will have, because if I live long enough, I'm assuming I will have. I don't know whether you've always had visible disability, but that, in a sense, I mean, a bit like the color of your skin or your outward-facing gender, etc. It's like it's unavoidable in terms of bigotry, because people kind of instantly can put you in a box. How did you make sure that your box was of your own definition?
Namaste from India, Talufa. Now, I will just describe about my disability. I'm sitting here in front of you on a wheelchair because a bus hit my car and broke my spinal cord at the level of my neck. So everything below my neck is dead. No sensation, no movement. And if I don't sit on this chair, which has a high back, just with the touch of one finger, if you touch me or poke me, I will fall down. I have no balance. My fingers have all been impacted because of the disability. I was on the other side, a gold medalist all through my career, a national debating champion, a national basketball player, and this one accident, and it brought everything down. In no time, I was unwanted. I was humiliated. I had qualified, many of you must be knowing about the bureaucracy, the civil services. I qualified that. I was to become a bureaucrat. Overnight, they thought that this person with a spinal cord injury and bent fingers cannot be a bureaucrat. They rejected me. Out of this pain and this anger, I started looking for outlets. There were no laws in India then. There was not a single law to protect my right or tell them to be a bureaucrat, an administrative officer. You need your brains and not much of your leg. That's when my journey began, to make people conscious and aware that those with disability are beyond their disability. The wheelchair, the calipers, the crutches, the hearing aids, these don't define us. You have to go beyond the wheelchair to discover me, to find out what a wonderful person out there is to make friends with, who can talk about issues, who has a lovely heart, which feels a lot. My struggle was mainly because I was a taxpayer. I was paying taxes to the government, but I was not getting any of the basic facilities. No road for me to drive in. No public transport I could get into. No schools or colleges that accepted me. So the journey began to have laws in India to protect our rights. So from zero laws, I'm very happy and proud to tell all of you that we have been in the forefront to have 5 strong laws in India, and we have a UN convention which protects our rights and considers our rights as the same as human rights. But what has been difficult, Jude, what has been really difficult is breaking down attitudes. Oversights. I want to give a small example because this session is about leave no one behind. We are a strong forum here. We are in solidarity with each other. A small example from yesterday. We all took a group photograph. Everybody was out there. But we all forgot our sisters with disability. Me on a wheelchair, Sarah on her crutch, sisters from Samoa with complete blindness, walkers, crutches. Did any one of you pause to think, where are our sisters with disability in the photograph? So these are oversights which we need to change. How do we change it, Jude? Should we take another photograph with sisters with disability in that?
I think so.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So this is a strong forum. Let us begin here. Let us stand in solidarity with our sisters with disability, because I assure you, we have a lot of potential. We have a lot of intelligence. We have a lot of rationality. And together all of us can work towards gender equalization, that is achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 5. Together we can, together we will. Thank you.
So, Sue Helen, I don't know anything about your lived experience. And honestly, this is not, a therapy session. But I think that it's often the case that people who have absolutely visible reasons for having been rejected or isolated or not included are often expected to do the labor of making the change happen. But that is not always the case. There are other people who also throw themselves into that labour for whatever reasons. So I'm interested to know from you, Sue Ellen, where your heart began beating strongly around human rights. What was it that motivated you?
Well, thank you very much, Jude. And talofa lava, and good morning to you all. Welcome to another very warm morning here in Samoa. I hope you're enjoying the warmth. In terms of my career path, if I'm very honest, I have to say I became a lawyer because I realized I couldn't become a doctor because I wasn't smart enough. But in saying that, when I became a lawyer, I realized that I was in a privileged position, and I was able to give a voice to many others around me. I'm very privileged that I grew up surrounded by many inspirational people. I had grandparents, I had parents who constantly gave back to society. That was always their motto: how can we help? They instilled those values into all of us, their children. I also have to, listening to my colleagues here on the panel, I feel very humbled to be amongst such amazing people who have done amazing work already. I have to acknowledge my privilege because I grew up with amazing parents who provided a safe and empowering home for us all. I realized that is a true privilege. In my current job, my boss is a woman, a very strong woman, the Honourable Prime Minister of Samoa, Naomi Mta'afa, who has been an inspirational leader not just here in Samoa, but in the region and also on the global stage. I feel very privileged that I have a boss like that. I work in a profession which is now dominated by women. It wasn't always, but it is now dominated by women. And as I said, I'm particularly honored and privileged to be on this very esteemed panel of ladies up on the stage today. And I look forward to hearing more from their insights. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Swan. I think it's important to recognise that if you are born with privileges, well, we're all born with some privileges, actually, unless we're in exceptional circumstances. We have some privilege and some agency. And it's important not to feel guilty if you have been born into a situation where you have the rights that other people wish they had. Because everybody wishes to have the rights to be able to live a happy, even life. And if you've got those rights already in some way, then the main thing is not to squander them, but use them well for other people. So I think, sometimes people can be embarrassed to sort of jump in and get involved because they think, well, I know nothing about this, it's nothing to do with me. But believe me, if you leave it always to other people to solve their own problems on their own from a place where they have less agency, then that's not a good thing. So I think it's important that, this idea of solidarity is to put privilege and isolation together, and then you can really make change happen. Again, I'm not making any assumptions, Heike, about your life, but tell us a little bit about it. Because when I said to you this morning, can you tell us a little bit why you were so enthusiastic about being in this arena? You looked a bit shocked, as if it was nothing to do with your life, but of course it must be. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jude, for this question. And in fact, yes, it really prompted me to think about what it was that, propelled me into this work on human rights. It's really going back to my teenage years, I suppose, because I always felt this very strong sense of justice. And when I remember one of my very first and early memories as a child was that corporal punishment was still allowed in Germany 50 years ago when I was a little child. And in my very first year in school, I had my knuckles rubbed by my teacher. And of course, it was outlawed then after that, probably about 50 years ago. And that was a really, really deeply traumatic experience. I thought it was horrible. And so when I was about 17, I founded an Amnesty International group with some colleagues of mine, friends of mine, and so ever since then I've been sort of working in that field. And later, of course, I worked in the Council of Europe and the United Nations, and when I was working in the United Nations, I felt it was wonderful to team up with a lot of the governments that actually want to make a difference, because I truly believe that many do. We can all work together with civil society and governments to jointly make a difference. I had the pleasure of being at the UN conference on human rights in Beijing, in Vienna, and also working on the Beijing conference about 3 decades ago. And that was, again, an amazing experience, because it really showed what you can do when you all team up across the different backgrounds, across different alliances perhaps also. And so my life in human rights, I guess, has always been about trying to create links and alliances, because I think that we cannot, if we're in one part of the world and working on human rights, let's say as a civil society activist, do it without the work of governments and vice versa. So I think that's been probably a driving factor in my life. Thank you.
So just to follow on from that, can you tell us what particular areas of human rights law you are currently in the middle of trying to change, and how is that going?
Sure. So our work is focusing on the 16 states that we cover as the regional office here in the Pacific, and it's 14 Pacific Island countries, Australia and New Zealand. And so we have a number of areas that we engage with, for example, technical cooperation on changing discriminatory legislation that is not in compliance with international human rights law. Many of the countries here in the Pacific, of course, have ratified important conventions such as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we help them at their request, and also at the suggestion of many of our international human rights mechanisms, to actually bring these pieces of legislation or policy or practices into compliance with their international commitments, because the commitments are voluntary. The states sign up to them on a voluntary basis, and we support them and work with them to ensure that they actually become more and more in compliance. That's also a lot of the work is together with civil society, again with people like Jolene and with other colleagues here. I see some members of the Pacific Disability Forum in the room as well, and several others from a number of the women's groups, of course, here around the Pacific. And these are all partners that we work with, as well as the governmental authorities, such as police forces, and correction services, or offices such as the Attorney General's office here.
So, I mean, I think that not everybody understands generally that these are voluntary situations, and that all over the world you have, you know, an overarching idea that these are the rights of inclusion, and then you have thousands of examples of exclusion at state level. It comes from a cultural attitude in general, doesn't it? It comes from a society going, well, we know you're telling us we ought to do that. We don't feel like doing it. We don't want to do it. Our people don't want us to do it, etc. So there's always this battle about a cultural attitude versus a legal idea. Are there any particular battles that you're currently involved in that you're trying to move the dial, maybe that we can even help with?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think one of the battles that our office is involved in, but really with the alliances of others, is to ensure that we maintain the civic space that we have here in the Pacific. Especially for women human rights defenders, anyone who is really engaged in defending the rights of women and girls to be free from violence, to ensure that persons of diverse sexual orientation and gender expression, really anybody who has a and experiences multiple discriminations, which is really the intersectional nature of our work, can live in freedom, dignity, and with their full rights here in the Pacific. And I think this is important because we have seen some attempts to curtail civic space, so freedom of participation, freedom of expression, right to access information about various issues, including, for example, information about the risks of a certain measures taken against climate change. We have seen that not all women human rights defenders are able to stand up for the rights of the most disadvantaged and marginalized women in some of the countries here. We still see, unfortunately, egregious violations against women who are subjected to very horrendous forms of sexual and gender-based violence. But we also see amazing alliances, such as the Pacific Human Rights Network, Human Rights Defenders Network, that we support from our office and who've been working for about 5 years very, very diligently to expand their network beyond Fiji, where they were originally based, to all of the countries of the Pacific. And these are the kind of long-term investments that we hope to foster with our office.
Okay, so this is an important thing to recognize, is that human rights lawyers around the world are often experiencing quite a lot of pushback, that they are themselves discriminated against, they are themselves isolated, they're targeted, sometimes they're killed, etc. And that's the reality. And for people who are defending issues around climate change and around women's rights and trans rights, etc., it's getting to be a very difficult space. So for those of you who are not directly involved in that, I think this is where solidarity really counts. And it's where education counts. Because when people chat about stuff, you have to know what stuff you're talking about. So, Jolene, I'm going to come to you because some of the rights that are violated are to do with cultural practice, which actually is inappropriate in terms of the original cultures anyway. I wonder if you'd just like to talk a little bit about, your research, your knowledge, what you'd like us to understand.
Thank you, Jude. I'd like to take us back, before I go into the cultural side, I'd like to take us back to pre-colonial times. What we need to remember is that LGBT people or Fa'afafine or ladies were always there before Christianity came into our shores. The only difference is we didn't have gender. There was no labeling until Christianity came into our shores. Then we knew about the difference between a man, a woman, a gay, a lesbian, or whatever, But we never labeled them when we were, in the olden days. They were, even when we read our history books, there were never any words to describe anybody that is different. And in our country and communities, Fa'afafine in Samoa and ladies in Tonga are always, we do not conform to binary, gender norms and all that. And we play a very important, and I'd like to resound what Joe Annandale, the Honorable Joe Annandale said yesterday, that we need to recognize the third gender, because if we don't, we're the ones who do all the dirty work. We do the cooking, we do the decorations. When it comes to conference, church conference, we're the ones who are doing the cooking, setting up the tables, decorating the church, everything. But when it comes to our personal lives, it becomes a matter, it becomes an issue. So, we work with our cultures, not against them. In Tonga, traditionally, we're guided by our 4 core values, as Lord Vaya mentioned yesterday. Fe whakaapa-apa-aki, mutual respect. Fe veitokai-aki, sharing and cooperation. Lototo, humility and generosity. And tauhivaha'a, loyalty and commitment. In Tonga, we use the Talanoa methodology. We lay out the mat and we start talking. We don't believe in riots, apart from those that wanted to believe on those things. I don't waste my time writing banners against anybody. If I need an issue to be discussed, I go to the church leader and sit down with that person. Or we invite them to our consultation. Because our culture, sometimes we are all mixed up in this religion. Nothing against religion. I love my Catholic religion, believe me. I will never change it for anything. They mixed up a lot of the biblical culture and our own culture that we grew up with, that our forefathers started with. And that is something that we need to recognize to make sure that we don't mix the two, because it becomes a problem.
You're trying to disentangle.
Exactly.
Not all clogged up.
Exactly.
And get people back into a situation where they can say, these practices are normal part of being a human society.
Absolutely.
And as you are able to give that knowledge back to people, to discover that actually this has always been here, this third sex, it's always been here, are you able to use that understanding to then give it as support to other excluded people? Do you see what I mean? I mean, do people kind of go, oh, maybe there's a reason why I'm also excluded because of cultural practice or ideas and prejudices and so on?
I think it all comes down to education. And we've been very privileged because our Lord Speaker actually asked us to translate the SOGI guideline, the UN SOGI's guideline. And you can just imagine what we had to go through. We're so poor in translations to those scientific words, right? And it took us a while, a few months.
We probably don't all understand what the SOGI guidelines are. Do you want to...
Sexual orientation, gender identity, expressions, and sexual characteristics. That's a mouthful.
Okay, well, you did it well then, yeah.
And I'm still learning too. And so when we translated that into Tongan language, we are the first one in the Pacific to actually do that. And now,
really?
To actually change that into the Tongan language. The reason why the Lord Speaker wanted us to do that is to educate our people and work closely. We've been able to work closely with the Ministry of Internal Affairs that allocated us to the Women Affairs, and I'm glad that the CEO is over here, that we've been trying to include that language into our Family Protection Act.
Okay, so this is a really key thing, isn't it? And by the way, I think people shouldn't be afraid if they don't know what the jargon is, because nobody really does. I mean, unless you are really well versed in it. So always ask, I always do. But translating into language, into people's own language, this seems to be an absolutely key thing, because language excludes in its own way, doesn't it? And so by making something visible in language, you're also able to clarify, etc. What are you struggling with at the moment? What have you achieved, and what are you still struggling with in terms of, practical things that are being done?
I think we've gone past the struggle. I mean, we still have the few things that we're struggling with, is making our people understand the differences between all these different genders, right? And identities. What we're trying to do now is to educate our people to have the knowledge that there's a difference between a trans man and a lesbian, because everybody calls everybody a lesbian. When they see one, oh, that's a lesbian. But they don't know there's a difference between a trans man. There's a difference between a gay person and a trans woman, because of their own, and it depends on their sexual orientation. It all comes down really to education and knowing where we...
Okay, so it's about giving people proper education, proper knowledge, loss of fear of the language, just simple definition, and being able to talk about it. And I just say this because you'll be going back to other countries where perhaps this clarity isn't available, and make sure it is. You don't have to be a trans person. You don't have to be somebody carrying the identity issue to make a change in your own society. And this is the key thing. So, Steve, you were nodding earlier when I said, don't ask other people to do all the emotional labor for the thing that they've had to fight for all their lives anyway. But, I mean, you've always been in the political sector, as you said, since you were 13. And, you know, you said government was slow and you couldn't, you know, cope with the speed of it, but now you're back in government. And I want to know, what are the changes that you're currently practically trying to make or have made that you think we could learn from and we could adopt too?
I've only been in office for 100 days.
That's enough. We have great expectations of you.
Look, but I want us to track back a little bit, you know, because the fact that we allow a situation where survivors are the ones that must fight laws or policies or call for recognition when they fight against gender-based violence. Black people must fight oppressive systems, you know, that has invalidated them. You know, women are left to fend for themselves, to fight oppressive systems of patriarchy and misogyny. So for me, that is quite important, you know, in really when we look at solidarity and so forth. You know, and I've spent the last 25 years, you know, at least at Max, fighting injustices, you know, in many forms. You know, my country has a constitution, and I spoke a little bit about it, that really guarantees freedom, equality. And consistently, you have to lift up where inequality is. You know, we have had to say, if Section 9 of our Constitution says that no one will be discriminated or should be discriminated on the basis of their sex, gender, sexual orientation, race, class, or whatsoever, in many grounds. But in practice, that is not translated into lived reality for many. And that's why we find ourselves speaking here and talking about leaving no one behind. Because we have to actualize what it means to leave no one behind. When you have same-sex practicing individuals who don't have the same equal rights as heterosexual couples, just to be themselves and to love. You can imagine, as an African growing up and being told it's un-African to be gay.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
All I know is to be an African. And by the way, all I really wanted to do, besides all of the brilliant things that I've done in my life, I really wanted to be a girl that plays soccer. But I was forced to be where I am. Right? Because of circumstances. That's all. But by the way, even that, playing soccer as a girl, we know what is the status of women's soccer. Or women in sports. The pay gaps are extremely wide. So we constantly have to be fighting systems of inequality. So, of course, now, with all the things that we've done, whether it's same-sex marriage, whether it's amending quite a lot of policies, including the newly passed law that we have in South Africa, which is the hate crimes law, that it is now criminal to hate. You will be arrested even if you utter a word that is homophobic, transphobic, that discriminate persons with disability or anybody else on the basis of their color of their skin. It is criminal. And you will be arrested in South Africa for those kind of things. Because we don't want to go back to the time where we know exactly what it meant as a black person, where you were told you're going to use that door. In fact, not even that one, you'll use the back one. And for white people, they will have the privileges to walk anywhere, anytime, without an identity document. We don't want to go back to that. But what we have to do now is to safeguard the rule of law, to safeguard what we have actually made as a promise to equality. And we have that opportunity. You know, I went into elections, and I went into saying that it's relevant to participate politically in my own political home. My own political home is African National Congress, Congress, which is the oldest liberation movement of the great Nelson Mandela's and many others, right? And the idea of Freedom Charter, the idea of liberation will continue. But my generation defines the generational mission that says that we must still actualize it until everyone is free. And that's exactly what we're doing, including doing it while one is in government.
So making a hate crime something which people, can't shout racist comments, they can't shout homophobic comments, etc., because they'll be arrested. How will you close the gap between another law and the society actually not caring anyway?
Absolutely.
Not observing. How will you close the gap?
Look, law on its own is not enough. We know that. The really details are in the pudding itself. Education is part of it. Implementing campaigns of social behavior change plays an important role. So you can't do this without taking society along. You can't do this. So if at all, for instance, Jolene was speaking about the role of religion, you can't take away the faith of people, right? Or religion. But what you can do, there are brilliant minds, theologists and so forth, who brings alternative and not so harmful theological understanding of what is love and what constitutes non-judgmental, same principles that Jolene was referring to, that we are all made in the image of God. I'm not a theologian myself, but there are brilliant theologians who can provide those perspective. And then even if you look at law, I mean, many people in the law space and so forth, you have to actually make sure that you really look at what is prescribed and how it's translated and how you actually secure justice. Both religion, both law, and any other kind of sectors seeks one thing in common, and that is justice.
And so do you have a public campaign, like a PR campaign to society, saying, we've introduced this law, this is what it means, like on the buses or in the radio stations? Or how do you get civil society to understand what they need to do in response to a law?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I found that the only existing law clinic, queer-led law clinic in South Africa, and in fact in the region, because there isn't any. And you constantly have to establish campaigns that suits a particular thematic area. When I even led the first LGBTI HIV plan in South Africa, part of it was to then look at not only just respond in a biomedical context, but also to look at social and structural barriers that continue to perpetuate inequality. But at the same time, even now, one of the things, and I was speaking about the role that my president, His Excellency Ramaphosa, is playing. You know, for someone who speaks constantly, he's the only president after President Nelson Mandela, by the way. If you take all his speeches for the last 5 years, I don't know how many times he has quoted LGBTI people, he has quoted women and gender equality. He's the only after Nelson Mandela who consistently do that, because you have to start there. You start with the leaders, and you are subjected as a person who lives the life to always remind the leader that actually whatever that you're going to say publicly, please make sure that you refer and you make sure you include these words, because you constantly have to change that. But you go to the ground. And what we are responsible for is to always engage communities in the language they understand. I'm an African. My indigenous language matters. So I'm not constantly going to speak a language that came by ship, right? Because English is not my mother tongue. Afrikaans neither was my mother tongue. Those were the two languages that came into my country or that came into Cape Town. But my language, which is Tswana, I have to constantly speak to my people in a language they understand, so that we impart knowledge, but also we don't perpetuate harm. Sometimes you can come across people who are ignorant, but sometimes you come across people who really don't know. And you have to be patient, because you've subjected yourself to that, to also impart that knowledge. And when they join you, you become much bigger. number to start educating others, because ultimately you do need that change to happen.
Yeah. So, you can't make people visible. People will be left behind unless they're included at all times. And your point yesterday, which is that you weren't included in the photograph, is a visible example. So this is a really important thing, which is if you are ever in charge of anybody's speeches, if you're ever advising somebody on their TV appearance or their radio, whatever, keep badgering them to say LGBTQ+, or mention disability rights, speak about gender rights. I mean, the more it is spoken about in society as a normal practice, the more ordinary people think, oh, well, that's just like who we are, isn't it? Who we are is what society does then. And unless who we are includes all of us, then society will continue excluding. Now, you've talked, Shriti, to me about some really practical things, which is data disaggregation, that actually the facts and figures around disability are not made available because you just lump all the data together. And actually, if you really want to make change, people have to know what they're trying to change and what's. So we could just talk a little bit about that.
And data is very important. That's the reason the Sustainable Development Goals talk about it in SDG 17. Talk about it's very, very important to have a number. I will give you one small example, say a climate emergency. Unless we know there are how many women, disabled women out there who cannot hear, who cannot walk, who cannot see, or who have other challenges. You see, mine is visible, Jude. But there are hundreds of people out there whose disability is not visible. So they need calm spaces, counselors. So unless we have data, we cannot really have a budget. Unless we have a budget for a particular thing, we don't know. We don't know in a school how much we should invest so that there are books for the visually impaired, books in Braille, books in audio. So disaggregated data is something which we need. Already the World Health Organization and World Bank, they have come with the statistics. They say 16% of the world, it's a big number, 16% of the population. You may be in a village, you may be in a country, a continent, but 16% has a disability. And that's huge. But what is happening in individual countries is this number is getting skewed. In my own country, India, we are after the census officials who say the official statistics in 2011 is 2.9%. So when there are 100 people in your school, in your village, but you're planning for only 2, then how can that gap ever be fulfilled? There will be illiterates. The people will not have employment. People will not get an accessible bus because you have 100 people out there who need a low-floor bus, but you are catering for only 2. So disaggregated data is something which we need, and 2030 is the year we are looking forward to, because that's when we are going to count all the numbers.
2030.
2030.
Is when you're going to...
Yes, we are looking at the numbers. And just one more thing. If you look at what Jolene said and Steve said and disability movement, you see, human beings, we have this psyche. Anything a little different, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 nose, color of the skin, immediately society is afraid, defensive. Oh, and they start putting up barriers. I think as a forum here, this is where we need to stand together and say, let us break all these barriers. Because at the end of it, barriers are only in our thinking, in our mind. And every barrier can be broken if we all come together.
So, again, I know I'm constantly sort of saying, so how about this and how about that? But if you are responsible for writing reports of any kind, if you are responsible for the school system, if you're responsible for any aspect of your society, don't wait until you are run over by a bus to decide that disability matters. It's when you are fully able to have the power and no other obstacles that you can be of the most value to people who are having to spend so much energy finding some power. So I just want to keep on saying that please don't ask everybody to do the emotional labor for their own particular disadvantage, because that's what women are asking of men. Women are saying to men, you know, you have patriarchy, you have the power, please could you do something about it to shift where the power lies. So this is something that we're all involved in. So can I come to you, Sue Helen, which is, what do you think? I mean, you're advising lots of leaders, and you are a leader yourself. What do you think you've seen as the most practical way of getting leaders, if you like, to turn their focus onto inclusion and make sure that it happens? How do you make that happen yourself?
Thank you, Jude. It's a really important question, and the list of what can be done is endless. We could go on for hours talking about what could be done and should be done. Before I come to the question, I'd like to first acknowledge and recognize that progress has been made. And I'd like to acknowledge the work that has been done for the last 3 or 4 decades, or probably even before that, that has brought us to today. I know we heard yesterday from a lot of speakers that sometimes it feels like we've been talking this talk for decades at many forums, and there's no progress. From where I sit, I see there has been some progress in that the number of cases that are being reported, the SGBV cases being reported, the numbers do keep going up. Yes, that does seem like a negative, but it also means that we have given a voice to victims. They have a space that they can go to. The work that is done by organizations such as SVSG that we heard from yesterday created a refuge space for our people here in Samoa, for our women and young children, where they can seek refuge until they find the strength and the voice to speak out and tell their story. This, to me, is progress, and we need to applaud their work a lot more often. The work of people like Seleniu Lina Chang, who has been amazing in this space. I even see in the audience today, I have my friend here, former police inspector Annie Laumea. When I was a young prosecutor in the Attorney General's office, she was doing amazing work within the police and still does now, even in her retirement years. She refuses to retire. I'd like to applaud former Inspector Annie Laumea for her work in this space. Because I think it's very important that we recognize this. But as we heard from Secretary General yesterday, the Right Honourable Patricia Scotland, the work is not done. There's still a lot more work to be done, and we have to keep our foot on the pedal, press that pedal to the floor, because as we've heard from everyone yesterday and again from my friends here on the stage, there's a lot of work that we need to do to push this forward. But I want to recognize that because of that, the work that has been done, I find myself in the privileged position that I am in now. As I said earlier, I grew up in a very safe, very empowering home with the parents that I had. As a young prosecutor, when I was first exposed to sexual offense files, it blew my mind. I couldn't believe that there were young kids growing up in such environments. And I feel now that the space that I'm in gives me that opportunity to help a lot more. So if I come back to the question, what can we do personally as leaders? If I could just highlight 3 things. Firstly, is a commitment to listening, to actually listening and hearing what needs to be done, what our people are calling out for. And then from that listening, we go on to what I consider to be a commitment to equity rather than equality, because there is not one size that fits all. We have to recognize that everyone is different, everyone has different needs, and as a government, we have an obligation to provide that service to our people. As members of our society, we all have a collective obligation to look after everyone in our communities. And then from that shift to equity, we can then recognize that all the individuals face several different layers of discrimination, as we've already heard. We have discrimination against race, gender, age, ability, economic status, health status, just to name a few. So as you keep saying, Jude, we need to make sure that these are incorporated into everything that we do. If there are speeches being made, that we are recognizing these layers of discrimination and how it impacts our women and girls in particular. In my current role now as Attorney General, I've been Attorney General for 3 years, but prior to that I was a lawyer in private practice. Started here in Samoa, spent some time in New Zealand and returned to Samoa 10 years ago. Coming back into public service has not been easy. Yes, government bureaucracy can be slow, but if we're not there doing something, it's going to be even slower. So we just have to keep moving forward. But I want to highlight 2 particular issues that I see are impacting our women in society today, amongst many other issues. One is the financial independence of our women. This is a sector that we need to constantly consider, because most of our women here in Samoa, and I imagine the same in our similar Pacific Island neighbors, most of our women are still financially dependent. Why is this important from the work that we do? I'll give you an example. In the SGBV space, when we are prosecuting sexual offences against women and children, where the perpetrator is the father or a brother or an uncle or close family member, these cases are very difficult to prosecute, because our cases depend solely on the victim being able to speak. So we thank organizations like SVSG for bringing those voices forward, but then in our part, we have to take these voices through to the court system. In the last 2 years alone, we have probably had to drop 30 to 40% of these types of cases because of financial dependency issues. The mothers, the daughters beg us to drop the case because they need the father back or the brother back for that financial dependence. Usually by the time the cases are ready to go to hearing, it would have been a few months. And in that time, the perpetrator would be in custody, loss of income for the families. It puts us in a very difficult position. It had been suggested to us that we should prosecute these girls for bringing false complaints, but why would we victimize them twice in that situation? And then we fall back to our civil organizations, our NGOs, to provide the refuge again. So, like I said earlier, progress has been made, but the struggle is still there. Also in our financial sector, in Samoa, you will notice there's an emergence of a lot of small loans businesses popping up around the country. These are necessary services because it targets our low-income people, and it affects a lot of our women. You'll find in Samoa, our women are taking out a small loan. When I say small loans, I'm talking 300 tala to 500 tala. These are not big amounts. They'll take out a loan for White Sunday to prepare the children for White Sunday. And then it's Christmas time. So White Sunday is around September, October. Then there's Christmas. Another small loan is taken out. And then it's January, end of January, early February. School is starting. Another small loan to get the kids ready for school. If you're only taking out one small loan, you might be able to pay it off. But as you know, our small loans businesses have phenomenal interest rates, and they are compounded on a monthly basis. So by the time it's back onto repayment plans, they find they are in default. And then these cases, I'm a little bit sad to say, that these cases then usually end up in court. The lender or the small loans companies will take them to court and they will get a judgment order against the woman. Given that the woman couldn't pay the loan when it was due, they're not going to be able to pay the loan just because there's a judgment order. And by now, even more costs are incurred onto that. In Samoa, if you're in default of a judgment order, the court can then issue a warrant of committal to lock you up in prison for an unlimited period of time. I have come across women who have been locked up several times for the same loan, because while you're being locked up, you're getting more and more in default. So this is a current issue that we're faced with, and I want to acknowledge our Central Bank of Samoa, who is now looking into how to regulate these services in Samoa, because it is impacting our families across our society. So that's just to highlight that particular issue in the finance sector. I think it's another very prominent issue right now, not just in Samoa, but in the Pacific, is the prevalence of drugs in our societies and how this affects everybody, and especially our women. So you'll find that the majority of the users are male, or men and boys, but we are now also seeing it go into women are also becoming users. They have been influenced into it. But it's always the women that have to pick up the pieces. It's their husbands, it's their sons, it's their brothers who are faced with this addiction once it hits. As a society, as a government, we do not have the services to cater to that. We have not addressed how we equip our women and girls to cope in these types of situations. So there's, like I said, there's ongoing issues that are across all sectors that we can work in. And that's why if I go back to the commitment I made earlier, it's a call for government to make that commitment, to hear, to recognize the different layers of discriminations that are out there, and also to look at an equity-focused solution rather than equality, because all our needs are different. And just to repeat what the Secretary General yesterday said, it's press that pedal to the floor and let's keep on with the fight.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn over to you now. We've got 15 minutes left where you can ask questions. So there are some mics coming round, and while you're thinking, if you'd like to put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question, I just want to acknowledge the fact that we haven't represented neurodiversity on this panel, and there's many examples of other things that we could talk about. But I want to just mention that language, naming something, is so critical. The phrase neurodiversity was actually invented by an Australian academic called Judy Singer, who herself was suffering from Asperger's, or suffering is wrong, not inappropriate. She is Asperger's, her mother was Asperger's, and her daughter is Asperger's. And she came on the phrase neurodiversity because she wanted to say, like biodiversity, that many kinds of difference is a positive thing, not a negative thing. And before that, there wasn't a term that described it. So positive language that is specific is really key. Who'd like to ask something? Yes, could you take that microphone over there? If you wouldn't mind... Oh, there's mics on the table, sorry. So used to doing something else. Could you just say who you are as well? Thanks.
Talofa Lava, thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question to our esteemed panelists this morning. I am Alexandra Jacopo. With the Australian High Commission here in Samoa. I look after our gender, disability and social inclusion portfolio. So thank you very much for all of the reflections and the sharing this morning. Very valuable discussion. I'd just like to acknowledge that I really resonate with how everyone has expressed that we are all uniquely different, and that we also have a responsibility to recognize those differences as well. I think I was very interested in what was mentioned in terms of the correlation between the cultural attitude versus the legal battle. I was just interested in understanding some of your reflections, in terms of noting the different contexts that we work in and the communities that we represent. How can we ensure solidarity or a commonwealth that continues to thrive in harmony, that continues to thrive and live in harmony for generations to come? Because I think, noting from the opening ceremony yesterday, just seeing a lot of the great participation and representation from our children and youth, just wanted to get your perspectives on, how can we continue to live in, solidarity of, with a commonwealth that continues to thrive and live in harmony.
Okay, I'm going to try and take 2 or 3 questions and then pass it on. Anybody else would like to ask a question? Yeah, thank you at the back there.
Can I be heard? Okay, can. Stephen Boniface George Bwire Wandera Oundo, that is my name. I am the president of the Commonwealth Association of Architects, and I'm from Kenya. Mine will not be a question, it will be a quick sharing of experience, which I think is relevant to this distinguished forum, and it's to do with ladies in leadership. Back in Kenya, right now, we are honored and privileged to have the Chief Justice in Kenya, who is also the President of the Supreme Court, as a lady. We also have the Deputy Chief Justice, who is also the Deputy President of the Supreme Court, a lady. We also have the Attorney General, the first ever, who was recently appointed, a lady. And we also have the Law Society of Kenya President, all ladies in leadership, but within the law fraternity. And we've had a great presentation from the Attorney General here from Samoa. Congratulations to you in your good role. Quickly shift to my sector, which is architecture. When I was in first year at the university, we were 34 students in class, only 4 ladies. When we finished after 6 years, none of them finished. Fast forward, I got the honor and privilege of becoming the president of the Architectural Association of Kenya, and I've been behind women taking up leadership on competency, not just on gender, but on competency. And I finished my term as president in 2013, and subsequently, because of the systems I've put in place, we've managed to have 3 presidents who are ladies after my term. So the last 4 presidents of the Architectural Association of Kenya, 3 are ladies. That's a great, great milestone. Moved to one other organization, the Association of Professional Societies in East Africa. I got the privilege of chairing that organization. We'd never had a lady. We've also had one after me. What am I basically saying? There's a lot that is happening in the sector within leadership from women, and it's on competency, not just gender. Yeah. And I would like us to keep that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My names remain the same.
Thank you. Important. And also, architecture, the built environment, nothing could be more important than acknowledging all the issues in the built environment of inclusion. So if you have a gender-aware leader, then that is absolutely critical. Anybody else want to make a question over there? Yes, thank you.
When it comes to technology. Talofa and kia ora, my name's Monica Moore. It doesn't really matter who I am because who really cares right now. My question is, loving what everybody's saying. Jolene, about the labels, that absolutely touched me. Drop the labels and see the people, but language, which is my area of expertise, how do we make that transformation? I coach a young woman, and when she speaks, she says, what do you see when you look at me? I bet you see my disability. And then she talks about what we can't see. So how do we drop the labels? Because that can be both empowering and disempowering.
Okay. One more before we... Yes, somebody over there with a flower? That could be anybody.
Is it working now? Oh, sorry. My name is Dr. Karaponi Ogusenengafa. I'm an obstetrician. I am a lecturer at the University of Auckland, and I'm also a senior lecturer at the School of Population Health and head of Pacific Health. My question is, I'm a clinician. To Jolene, please, I hope you don't mind. I'm a clinician as well as a senior lecturer and academic in health now, and also in policy, as well as a university. We are pushed to use non-gendered language in the university, in our guidelines, as well as in the hospitals, in the hospital guidelines. The difficulty I have is because yesterday, we know, and yesterday I do agree with the third gender, is how now do we take it to these really powerful organizations in New Zealand where women's voices are now no longer important. knowing that for generations in the past, that there's women who have fought to be where we are. That's why I'm able to have a job. I'm able to be educated. And now we're having a real struggle in New Zealand with now where do I stand, even in our Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, that now are we not allowed to use the word women when we're managing childbirth? So I'm just really struggling with the gender difference. I mean, in the islands, it's not an issue, and I love it here because, you know, LGBTQ is normal for us. We grew up in my class at school. It was just so normal for us. But when we go to places like New Zealand, Australia, we are now really struggling as Pacific in this space. So I just wanted to ask the question, please. You might be able to help us in those spaces. Thank you. Sorry.
We understand. So there's some specific things there, which is, first of all, what to do with the issue of definition as opposed to, you know, genderlessness, as it were. Another is how do we, I think, push the cultures forward in terms of new understandings and allowing a peaceful transition of new understandings inside societies. And I think in a way that is part of the same question, which is like, how do we close these gaps? Because we've all agreed that you need law, but you need cultural permission for the laws to come into being. So who'd like to take the question about, Jolene, do you want to pass a, yeah, and Steve, do you want to? Yeah?
No, thanks, Jude, and really thanks to the delegates for asking these important points. Maybe I'll start with Stephen right there at the back. I think you've done fantastic work, but I don't want us to confuse when does gender apply and when does competency apply, given the fact that for so many aching years, women simply have been excluded in the systems, including access to education. Gender is important. Transformation is important, and we must be intentional. In fact, studies have proven, you know, everyone, men, women, it doesn't matter, have to undergo, when given that opportunity or privilege, people can be competent. So no question about competency. But the fact that you are women, it actually puts barriers in front of you before you can even exercise your competency. And I really want us, when we look at women inclusion and when we advocate for gender equality, we mustn't question it whether they can compete or not. They will compete. They can, and women are able to compete without even question. But the fact that, you know, sexism and patriarchy always keeps women at the back end. We really have to be aware of that. But I'm really appreciative of you sharing, you know, the Kenyan story for that matter. But that's a lived reality everywhere where we find women being excluded. But when we are transformational and we are intentional in ensuring that we remove the barriers, women can. And I think that also goes with the experiences of LGBTI people. It's not just whether we include LGBTI people just only because they are gay, lesbian, or trans, or intersex for that matter. When given the opportunity, when we remove the discrimination, stigmatization, inequalities, they can compete easily. So that prosperity, we must open it up for everybody so that they can exercise competency, they can participate equally, but also they can contribute to the economic status whichever way. And I think maybe the issue of language, and I'll just be brief on that. I don't want us to also confuse the issue of identity politics. Sexuality is broad, complex, and so forth. Sex is what we disaggregate. Gender is what we analyze, because gender is not biology, it's a social construct. And I find it quite a lot of time that there's always this confusion you know, about sex and gender. because sex is biology, it's the biological effects. But often when you look at the language, which is quite important point that is, you have to define, certain sectors requires you to prescribe and define a specific language. But I think when you actually look at the expression of identity, the expression of people saying that, see me for who I am. When you actually listen to what Jolene, and Jolene is here, can answer for herself. But when you actually listen to the fact that how people are boxed, and they are boxed not in their own perspective, their own autonomous view, and they're boxed when their own bodily integrity is not respected. That's where also sometimes people say, drop this language, it's not me. For a moment, wait, I'll tell you who I am. Don't label me. I will tell you who I am. So language must not just be that we are saying, take away everything else that people know. No, but there's an alternative way of respecting autonomy, respecting bodily integrity of individuals, and also listening to people for who they are. Because boxing people always is the one, that labeling that victimizes people, that excludes people in that. So in language, in public health, in everything, we can work with what we have. We can improve what we have so that we are inclusive in our approach. That way, we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Jolene, yeah?
Did you want to? No.
You speak, yeah.
And just to add on, I'm not going to go into more details, because Steve has already covered quite a lot. But I want us to think of the word solidarity and harmony. In order for us to actually stay in solidarity and work in harmony, we need to work with all our networks. In Tonga, I work with LGBTI people. Ofa Gutenbale, who is a dear friend and a colleague and ally, works with Women and Children's Crisis Center. With the young leaders, the young women's leaders, Elizabeth Kite works with young women in Parliament. And in order for us to actually put together something to lobby for change or anything, we needed to come together, take our labels out of the way, and sit as women and work for the goodness of everybody. It's not about us. It's not about me. It's not about the crisis center. It's not about the young leaders. It's all about everybody that is concerned. And not only that, but we need to make sure that we use or use our cultural terms, because sometimes when we go into to the platforms of like New Zealand, from the Pacific, it's no problem when we're sitting in our own little comfort zone in our islands. But when we go to the Western world, we turn to use or adapt to the Western terms because we want the funding, we want the privileges that the white people have. But that is something that I've always been about, is using those terms. In Tonga, we don't use LGBTIQ. We use our own terminology. We all use our own terms. Leiti. I mean, the word whakaleiti was not even a Tongan word. The word that I grew up with was whakawhawhide, or whakatangata. There was no whakaleiti until a researcher from England came and started doing her research. Then she came up with that word whakaleiti, like translating is like a lady. A trans person, a person who was born as a man and dressed like a woman. I identify as a woman. I live as a woman. I eat as a woman. I go to the bathroom as a woman. I do not stand, I sit. And So these are things that we need to understand. We need to change the mindsets of people because they label you. As soon as they look at you, they label me already. But you don't know what's inside me. I'm a trans person. I'm a trans mother of 3 beautiful children and 5 beautiful grandchildren. And I've just had my last grandchild born about 2 weeks ago. And I'm proud of it.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're really running out of time. I just wanted to quickly come to you, Heikki, and then I'm going to come to you finally. So you wanted to add some thoughts in? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just in response to the question that was first asked, I think, as Jolene has also just mentioned so eloquently, it is really important to honor our diversity, but we also have to recognize that everybody has the same rights. And I think that is the human rights perspective that we really need to remember. And it's what I was saying earlier about the voluntary commitments. All states that have become states parties to the international conventions have done so voluntarily. So they have entered into those legal commitments voluntarily. Nobody's pushed them. In fact, there's been a lot of engagement perhaps preceding those ratifications. And we do hope that the last country in the Pacific that has not yet ratified CEDAW will also ratify CEDAW sometime soon.
Is that country?
That's Tonga.
Okay.
But we're very much hoping that we will welcome them within the community of the Commonwealth, the United Nations, and all of the countries that actually are working towards non-discrimination, because that principle is in all of the UN conventions, not the CEDAW. It's also in CRPD, it's in the Child Rights Conventions, and it's in the Migrant Workers Conventions, and so on. We haven't spoken about all of the other discriminations that are potentially intersectional and interact with gender equality. We could have talked about those also that are not perhaps citizens of countries here or in other Commonwealth countries, because they are often the most deprived, even more deprived than citizens. When you're a refugee, when you're a displaced person from another community, it's very hard for them. So I think for us, that's really the bottom line. And it is not a policy choice. Once you have ratified these conventions, once you're working on ensuring that there's, more action taken to address these intersectional discriminations, you are working towards it on a legal basis and with legal obligations. You have reporting obligations. You have the obligation to involve your civil society in your reporting. You have the obligation also to work with all of those in society that are perhaps perpetuating these stigma and harassment and discrimination, like the Attorney General does in her job, like Nolene does in her job, and the Deputy Minister, and of course a representative here from India. Everybody has their own contribution to make, and I think that's the beauty of working against intersectional discrimination and for equality. Thank you.
Thank you. And Shriti, would you like just to bring us to a close?
Yes, it is regarding, Jude, what you said. We have now strong conventions regarding all the kind of discriminations that exist. We have strong international conventions, and most of the countries now, they have strong laws and policy. So legal and policy environment is strong. But what is happening, which you are asking, is the gap. The gap in implementation, the gap at the level of people, society, community. How do we bring about that change? One thing I have done over the years and have been successful is, the best way is to go to our children, go to our schools, the primary schools. Children are wonderful listeners. If you play games with them, you tell them stories. The message is very strong and it remains with them all their life. That's one source. The other is to conduct a lot of dialogues. We can have dialogues everywhere, over a cup of tea, in the libraries, in the marketplace, wherever we are meeting after our we go to church on Sunday, we go to temples. After our formal activity is over, we can discuss. The more and more number of informal dialogues that we can have, this problem of etiquette, this problem of language, this discrimination will disappear.
Thank you. So it's been an amazing dialogue with all of these wonderful people. And I hope that when you now go out and get your tea and do what we call networking, I hope you'll be able to carry on having a proper dialogue with people. I mean, just find out, like, why they are doing what they do. Not just what is their job, but why. Why? And then, you know, the provoking thought is, what can we do that we didn't think we were going to do when we came in this morning? What are we now going to do as a result of this panel today? Something different, hopefully. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you at the next panel.